Please, someone fucking kill Tony.
Tony Hinchcliffe walking into Kevin Hart's Netflix roast was always going to carry an unusual energy. Tony is one of the few working comedians whose entire public identity is built almost exclusively around the roast format. He created and hosts Kill Tony. He came up through roast battle culture and built his reputation on being willing to say the harshest thing in the room before anyone else gets there first. By every measure, a celebrity roast should be his most comfortable environment. But Tony did not walk into that room clean. He carried significant baggage with him, and a much larger audience than he had before was now aware of exactly who he was. After the 2024 Trump rally controversy, Tony's name broke through to a mainstream audience that had never engaged with Kill Tony or roast comedy culture. What had previously been a reputation contained within a specific comedy subculture suddenly became a much broader public conversation, and not one that framed him particularly favorably to people encountering him for the first time. So when he appeared at one of the most visible comedy events of the year on a Netflix platform with a global reach, the room he was walking into was not the same room he would have entered a year earlier. The stakes were different, the eyes on him were different, and the audience judging him extended well beyond the people who had been following his career from the beginning.
I welcome migrants to the United States of America with open arms. And by open arms, I mean like this. And these Latinos, they love making babies too, just know that. There's a lot going on. Like, I don't know if you guys know this, but there's literally a floating island of garbage in the middle of the ocean right now. Yeah, I think it's called Puerto Rico.
Within comedy circles, Tony had always been known as the Kill Tony guy, a roast specialist with a reputation built over years in that specific lane. But after the Puerto Rico joke at the 2024 Trump rally became national news, that reputation expanded into an entirely different audience. Regular viewers who had never watched a roast battle in their lives now had a very specific and unflattering impression of who Tony Hinchcliffe was. That created a split perception that followed him into the roast. To longtime comedy fans, he is a professional in his element, someone who understands the format better than most. To the broader mainstream audience, he is a walking controversy, a name associated with a moment that generated widespread backlash and dominated the news cycle for days. That split is exactly why his presence at Kevin Hart's roast became its own subplot before he even delivered a single line. Kevin's name was on the special. Kevin was supposed to be the story. But Tony being in that room introduced a separate layer of curiosity that ran alongside everything else. People wanted to know whether the comedian who built an entire career on making other people squirm in the hot seat could handle the experience of being on the receiving end of that same energy. That is precisely where Pete Davidson enters the picture.
Looking like both a child molester and the doll they give the child to show where he touched them. Tony reminds me of Charlie Kirk, in that he's definitely been on camera letting a guy unload in his throat. Oh, you don't know me? You don't know me? Yeah. Yeah. Kill Tony! Please, someone fucking kill Tony. Tony, nothing you say tonight will hurt my feelings. I was in a beef with Kanye, so I've taken shots from better gay Nazis.
Pete going after Tony worked as well as it did because Tony is such a naturally compelling target in that specific context. The entire premise of Kill Tony is built on a power dynamic. Young comedians walk out, deliver 1 minute of material, and then Tony decides their fate. Praised, destroyed, dismissed, or turned into a recurring punchline for the audience's entertainment. That structure is the show. So when someone flips the script and puts Tony on the receiving end of that same dynamic, there is an immediate and very human satisfaction to it. People enjoy watching the judge get judged. That impulse does not require any deep analysis. It is just instinctively satisfying to see. That does not mean Tony struggled with it. He understands the architecture of roast comedy better than most people working today. If you construct an entire career around insult comedy and publicly dismantling other performers, you have to be prepared for people to swing back. And by most accounts from people who watched, Tony held his own when the shots came his way. He is quick, comfortable in confrontational rooms, and sharp enough to respond without falling apart. But the more layered story is about how that room receives him now, not just as a comedian doing his job, but as a figure carrying public weight he did not have before. Tony is genuinely respected within comedy for what he built. Kill Tony grew from a niche live show into one of the largest independent comedy platforms in the world, and that does not happen without real talent and real work behind it. But he also operates with a particular energy, a controlled, deliberate smugness that functions as both a signature and a liability. It is part of what makes him compelling to watch. It is also precisely what makes audiences eager to see him taken down a level. At Kevin Hart's roast, he was operating in a fundamentally different environment than the one he controls on a normal night. He was not at the comedy mothership surrounded by a crowd already tuned to his frequency. He was not sitting behind the Kill Tony desk with the authority to redirect the room whenever he chose. He was on Netflix, in a celebrity roast format, surrounded by bigger mainstream names, with an audience that included a lot of people who had never watched his show but had very strong feelings about the Puerto Rico moment. That is exactly why the Pete Davidson exchange got the attention it did. Pete is not typically positioned as the most dangerous roast comedian in any given room, but targeting Tony in that specific moment made complete strategic sense. Tony had become a villain figure to a significant portion of the mainstream audience, and Pete aimed at someone the crowd already had a loaded opinion about before the joke even landed. The punchline worked because the audience had already done half the work themselves. That is how comedy functions at this level now. The joke itself is only one component. The audience walks in carrying headlines, podcast clips, social media controversies, and accumulated grievances. By the time the comedian delivers the line, the audience is already primed to respond. The comedian is just the last piece of a setup the culture already built. Tony understands that mechanic as well as anyone. Kill Tony is essentially a masterclass in using accumulated context as comedic fuel. Regular guests become recurring characters, failed sets become documented history, awkward moments get clipped, shared, and referenced indefinitely. The show actively trains its audience to remember everything and weaponize it against whoever is standing on that stage. At Kevin Hart's roast, that same energy came back around and pointed directly at Tony, and that creates a dual reality for him going forward. On one hand, it puts him back in the conversation for what he actually does well, which is roast comedy. On the other hand, every room he enters now carries an elevated level of scrutiny. People are watching to see whether he pushes too far again, whether he gets humbled, whether he gets a negative reaction, or whether he demonstrates convincingly that he remains one of the best operating in that format regardless of what happened at that rally. Kevin Hart had his name on the special, but Tony Hinchcliffe became one of the night's parallel storylines because he represents an entire approach to comedy that people either deeply appreciate or fundamentally reject, and there is very little neutral ground between those two positions anymore.